The sun had barely slipped beneath the horizon when Reena entered her apartment, tossing her bag onto the sofa with a weary sigh. She paused for a moment, glancing at the cluttered room as if seeing it for the first time. The small one-bedroom place she called home had always felt like a sanctuary amidst the chaos of the city. Tonight, however, it felt different, quiet, too quiet. She tried to shake off the unease creeping up her spine, blaming it on a long day at the lab, the endless hours of data analysis, and the particularly unnerving encounter with her supervisor, Dr. Murdoch. She moved to the kitchen and poured herself a glass of water, hoping to wash away the feeling that something was off. Reena had spent the last 5 years working at one of the city's top research facilities, specializing in neurobiology and artificial intelligence. Her work, while groundbreaking, had also become increasingly controversial. She'd been exploring the gray areas of human cognition, venturing into the realm of memory manipulation and enhancement, a field fraught with ethical dilemmas. Lately, there'd been whispers around the lab of unauthorized experiments, missing subjects, and strange behaviors among the staff. Reena wasn't one to buy into conspiracy theories, but she had to admit there was something strange about the way Dr. Murdoch had been acting lately. He seemed distracted, almost paranoid. It was like he was hiding something. After a quick dinner, she sat at her desk and opened her laptop. She knew she shouldn't, but curiosity got the better of her. She navigated through the company's internal database, searching for the recent project logs. As a lead researcher, she had access to most of the files, but a new folder caught her eye, Project Elysium. She clicked on it, only to be greeted by an access denied message. A few more keystrokes and she was in. Her breath caught as she began to read through the documents. The project wasn't about cognitive enhancement at all, it was about something far more sinister. The research was aimed at altering memories, erasing them, and implanting new ones. The implications were terrifying. She scrolled through the pages, each revelation more shocking than the last. It wasn't long before she realized her name was listed among the authorized personnel. Reena's hands trembled as she scrolled further, her eyes widening at the list of test subjects. She froze when she saw a familiar name, Aaron Wells, her brother. She hadn't seen Aaron in over a year. He'd vanished without a trace after a heated argument over his involvement with a fringe activist group that opposed the very kind of research she was conducting. She had assumed he had gone underground to avoid the authorities, but now she wasn't so sure. Panic set in as she realized he might have been one of the test subjects. She closed the laptop abruptly, her mind racing. She needed answers, and she needed them now. The next morning, Reena arrived at the lab early, hoping to avoid Dr. Murdoch and any unwanted questions. She knew she was venturing into dangerous territory, but she couldn't just walk away. She made her way to the lower levels of the facility, an area restricted to only a few high-clearance personnel. Her heart pounded in her chest as she passed by the empty hallways, the hum of fluorescent lights overhead adding to the tension. She reached a steel door marked Elysium Sector and swiped her access card. The door clicked open, and she slipped inside. The room was colder than the rest of the facility, filled with strange machines and dozens of screens displaying brainwave patterns and neural maps. In the center, a single chair sat facing a massive screen, surrounded by wires and electrodes. Reena approached it cautiously, her eyes scanning the room for any sign of Aaron. She noticed a set of files on a nearby table and quickly rifled through them. Most were technical reports, but one document stood out. It was labeled Subject 47 Wells, Aaron. Her breath hitched as she opened the file and began to read. Her worst fears were confirmed. Aaron had been a subject in the experiments, his memories tampered with, his identity fractured. As she delved deeper into the file, she found a series of video logs. With a trembling hand, she pressed play on one of them. The screen flickered to life, revealing Aaron strapped to the chair, his eyes wide and vacant. Dr. Murdoch's voice could be heard off-screen, calm and clinical as he instructed someone to begin the procedure. Reena's heart sank as she watched her brother's face contort in pain, his cries muffled by the machine. She couldn't bear to watch anymore and shut off the video. Tears welled up in her eyes. What had they done to him? Reena's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. She needed to find Aaron, if he was even still alive. She couldn't trust anyone at the lab, not after what she'd seen. She needed help from outside, but who? As she stood there, her phone buzzed in her pocket, jolting her back to reality. She glanced at the screen. It was a message from an unknown number. "You're getting close. Meet me at the old factory by the docks. Come alone." Her pulse quickened. She didn't know who it was, but she had no other leads. She slipped out of the lab as discreetly as she'd entered and made her way to the docks. The old factory loomed over the waterfront like a decaying giant, its broken windows and rusted metal beams giving it an eerie appearance. Reena approached cautiously, every nerve in her body on high alert. She spotted a figure standing in the shadows near one of the abandoned entrances. As she got closer, she could make out a man in his late 40s, his face obscured by a hood. "Reena," he called out, his voice barely more than a whisper. She nodded, her hand instinctively reaching into her pocket for the small taser she always carried. "Who are you?" she demanded. The man glanced around nervously before stepping closer. "My name's Victor. I worked on Elysium. I need to tell you something." Victor's story poured out in rushed sentences, his eyes darting around as if expecting someone to jump out at any moment. He had been one of the original developers of the memory-altering technology, but had grown increasingly uneasy about the project's direction. He spoke of ethical lines crossed, of subjects taken without consent, of the gradual realization that they weren't just enhancing cognition, they were rewriting it. "Aaron was one of the last," Victor said, his voice trembling. "He fought back harder than the others. They couldn't control him. That's why they erased him." The words hit Reena like a punch to the gut. "Erased? What do you mean?" Victor looked at her with a haunted expression. "I mean they wiped everything. Not just his memories, his entire identity. He's like a ghost now, a blank slate walking around with no sense of who he was. They do this when subjects resist too much. They said he was too dangerous to leave as is." Reena felt her knees go weak. Her brother, erased. It was too much to comprehend. She stared at Victor, her mind reeling with questions, but one stood out. "Can it be undone?" Victor hesitated. "There's a chance, but it's risky, and it would require you to go back into the lion's den." Back at her apartment, Reena sat in silence, the weight of everything she'd learned pressing down on her. She wanted to believe there was a way to save Aaron, to restore him to who he was. But the risks were enormous. Going back to the lab, especially now that she was on their radar, could mean the end for her as well. She couldn't do it alone. She needed allies, and she needed a plan. Her thoughts drifted to an old colleague, Dr. Marcus Liang, who'd left the lab under mysterious circumstances a year ago. He had always been vocal about his concerns regarding the ethical boundaries of their research. Maybe he would help. Reena found Marcus living in a cramped apartment on the outskirts of the city, his face haggard and eyes hollow. He listened quietly as she explained everything she had uncovered, nodding occasionally but never interrupting. When she finished, he sat back, rubbing his temples. "I knew they were up to something," he muttered. "I just didn't know how deep it went." He agreed to help, but his conditions were clear. They had to act fast and be prepared for the worst. "They won't just let us waltz in there and reverse this," he warned. "We'll need a diversion, and we'll need to be ready to disappear afterward." They spent the next few days planning meticulously. Marcus had managed to keep access to some of the lab's older systems, and together they devised a plan to trigger a security breach in another part of the facility. It wouldn't give them much time, but it would be enough to access the core server where the memory data was stored. The night before they were set to act, Reena couldn't sleep. She kept replaying Aaron's video in her mind, his blank stare, his screams. She had to believe there was still something left of her brother to save. The following day, the plan was set into motion. Reena and Marcus entered the lab separately, trying to blend in with the morning shift. The facility was bustling, and nobody seemed to notice them slipping into the restricted area. Marcus began working on the diversion, his fingers flying over the keyboard as he initiated the breach. Reena's heart pounded in her chest as she made her way to the server room, praying they wouldn't be discovered before she had a chance to access the data. She reached the terminal and began inputting the commands, her hands steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. Minutes felt like hours as the server hummed to life. She scrolled through the files, looking for Aaron's neural map. Suddenly, alarms blared through the building, and the lights began to flicker. She cursed under her breath. The breach had triggered a lockdown. She needed to move fast. She found Aaron's file and quickly began downloading it onto a portable drive. Just as the progress bar hit 100%, she heard footsteps approaching several pairs, fast and heavy. She yanked the drive out and darted toward the exit, hoping Marcus had managed to slip out in time. Reena raced down the corridor, the sound of footsteps growing louder behind her. She could hear shouts, the clattering of boots against metal floors. She rounded a corner and nearly collided with Marcus, who was frantically gesturing toward a maintenance hatch. "This way," he yelled. They squeezed through the hatch just as security teams burst into the hallway behind them. The narrow duct led them out into a service tunnel beneath the building, and they ran, hearts pounding, lungs burning. They didn't stop until they reached the surface, where a car was waiting for them, engine running. Inside the car, Reena finally allowed herself to breathe. She clutched the drive in her hand like a lifeline, her mind racing with what they had to do next. "We have to find a secure location," Marcus said, his voice tense. "We can't do the reversal out in the open." They drove for hours, finally settling on an abandoned farmhouse miles outside the city. It wasn't much, but it would give them the privacy they needed to attempt the reversal. Reena knew the odds were slim, but it was the only shot they had. That night, they set up their equipment, calibrating the machinery they'd brought with them to interface with the data on the drive. Reena was terrified but determined. She couldn't let fear stop her now. They would attempt to rebuild Aaron's memories from the fragments left in the data, hoping it would be enough to bring him back. Marcus monitored the neural interface as Reena initiated the procedure. The room filled with a low hum as the machine began its work, mapping the neural pathways and attempting to re-establish connections. Hours passed, and tension mounted. Reena watched the screen, her eyes darting between the data streams and the neural maps. Marcus stayed focused, occasionally making adjustments. They worked in silence, knowing that one wrong move could mean the end of Aaron's chance for recovery. Suddenly, the machine began to whir louder, and the data streams accelerated. "This is it," Marcus muttered. "We're reaching the critical point." Reena held her breath, her fingers hovering over the controls, ready to act. Then, the machine fell silent. Reena's heart stopped. She glanced at Marcus, who stared at the screen, his expression unreadable. "Did it work?" she whispered. Before he could answer, they heard a sound of soft, confused moan coming from the other side of the room. They turned, and there he was. Aaron, lying on a makeshift bed, eyes fluttering open, his face a mask of confusion. Reena rushed to his side, tears streaming down her face. "Aaron," she whispered. "It's me, Reena." His eyes slowly focused on her, and for a moment she saw a flicker of recognition, a spark of something familiar. But the relief was short-lived. Aaron's eyes suddenly widened with terror, his body convulsing as he began to thrash against the restraints. Reena and Marcus tried to hold him down, but it was no use. He was stronger than they anticipated, his movements wild and erratic. "Something's wrong," Marcus shouted. "His neural pathways are destabilizing." Reena's heart sank as she watched her brother slip away again, this time not into oblivion but into madness. The procedure hadn't restored him. It had broken him further. The next few days were a blur of frantic attempts to stabilize Aaron, but it became clear that the procedure had done more harm than good. Reena was devastated. She had risked everything for a chance to bring her brother back, but instead, she had lost him all over again. She stared at the empty shell that was once Aaron, his eyes now vacant and lifeless, and felt a hollow ache in her chest. There was no going back from this. Marcus suggested they leave the city, find a place to hide where the lab couldn't find them. But Reena was done running. She knew what she had to do. She had to expose the truth. She would take the evidence they'd gathered and blow the lid off Project Elysium, even if it meant risking her life. She had to make sure this never happened to anyone else. As she prepared to leave, she took one last look at Aaron, wondering if he could still hear her somewhere deep inside. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I'm so sorry." With a heavy heart, she turned away, stepping into the darkness with a resolve she hadn't felt in years. She knew the road ahead would be dangerous, that she would be hunted, but she was ready. She would be the last whisper in the storm, a voice of truth in a world built on lies, and she would make them pay for what they'd done.